All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Bryce Covert. Bryce is the economic policy editor at ThinkProgress, which you can find at thinkprogress.org. You can also find her on Twitter at Bryce Covert. Bryce, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, so Bryce, you have written a lot lately about how we are in fact seeing the effects of the sequester coming into play, and for many people, the cuts have been frankly devastating. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Sure. Well, Congress enacted what we know as sequestration, these across-the-board automatic spending cuts. They were supposed to be so unpalatable that they would force Congress to act to reduce the deficit. Nothing happened. Now we're living with them, and they've already, as you just pointed out, taken a toll on many different populations in many different ways. Some of the immediate effects we're seeing, a bunch of low-income children have been already kicked out of their Head Start programs, which is early childhood education. Thousands of cancer patients have been turned away from clinics due to decreased funding for Medicare. Food pantries have closed. They just have less funding coming in. Schools on Native American reservations and military bases have taken immediate cuts due to their funding structures. And that's all, in many ways, just the tip of the iceberg. We're projected to see a lot of different cuts to many government programs that serve a lot of really vulnerable populations, low-income housing assistance, benefits for the long-term unemployed, child care subsidies. So we've already seen a lot of the impact, but we're going to keep seeing this as it rolls out this year if Congress doesn't act to fix the entire program of budget cuts.
Yeah, like you also wrote, Meals on Wheels is taking a major, major hit. And again, I don't know why we would want, homeless people to have food. I don't know why we want, elderly who can't get out of their homes to be able to eat. This is just madness. Why would we actually want that type of thing to happen in a free and open society?
In a very wealthy country, no less. We're looking at cutting funding for elderly people who have difficulty leaving their homes, getting a hot home-cooked meal every day. Yeah, I actually spoke to a bunch of Meals on Wheels directors across the country, and what I found most interesting and perhaps depressing is that all of them used the same exact phrase. They all said they were running at bare bones capacity. And they were describing not the impact of sequestration, but their current funding outlook. A lot of them have already taken budget cuts from state and federal funding that's been decreased. A lot of them rely on donations from the seniors themselves as well as from their local communities, and those have been down because everybody's been suffering from the economic downturn. So they've been working with a lot less, and now sequestration promises to take away a lot of funding for them. Tens of thousands of seniors could lose access to these meals. And, the people I talk to running these programs are trying very, very hard not to have that happen. They're looking at the many different ways they can deal with these cuts that will not include cutting down on services or closing centers that serve seniors. But as I said, they all are running on such low capacity already that they actually have very little wiggle room.
Unbelievable. You also recently wrote about domestic violence services being drastically sliced as well.
Yeah, this is a very disturbing example. Domestic violence service programs, again, similarly to Meals on Wheels, have already been struggling with funding. The vast majority have reported decreased government funding as well as from other sources. And sequestration is going to have a huge impact on them as well. It's predicted that they will see a $20 million drop in funding. That will mean over 70,000 domestic violence victims will no longer have access to recovery programs and shelters. And I think what's even more devastating about this is that demand is very high right now. There's been a survey for the past 4 years that has found increased demand every year, and it's just been going up and up. And part of that is that while there's not a direct connection between a down economy and domestic violence, is not a direct cause, it can be a triggering effect so that when couples experience financial strain, the violence can be triggered. They are reporting that it is more violent than before the crash. So there's this huge need for help, and we have just been cutting and cutting and cutting. And this last round of cuts could mean that some shelters are going to have to close their doors. Some services are going to have to be ended.
Unbelievable. We're gonna move on to the big picture in a couple minutes, but I want to hit a couple of the other, just get some of these facts out there before we move on and kind of talk about just the overall ridiculousness of these cuts. You also wrote recently about how some of the sequester cuts to the IRS is actually going to ultimately end up increasing by cutting IRS spending. We're actually increasing the deficit. Describe how that's actually going to end up happening.
Yeah, I think this one is a really good example of how stupid these cuts are. Because
Right.
They're automatic and across the board, there isn't flexibility, and so it ends up cutting everything all the same amount. There's really no room for cutting government waste if you could find it. The IRS is a very good example. The IRS is the agency that obviously is tasked with collecting tax revenues from American citizens and corporations. They do a pretty good job of it when they're running at full capacity, bringing in billions of dollars in revenue for the government. However, they're taking a cut just like everyone else, and in April they announced they would have to furlough more than 89,000 employees to cope with sequestration. And this is going to mean bringing in a lot less tax revenue. One estimate calculated that furloughing just 1,800, which is a very small number compared to sequestration, could mean losing $4.5 billion in revenue. So we are cutting this program by, some millions of dollars, and that will end up snowballing into losing billions, which just shows you that these cuts are not a smart way to reduce the deficit or to cut down on government waste.
I am talking to Bryce Covert. Bryce is the economic policy editor at ThinkProgress, thinkprogress.org. Yeah, this whole thing is really, really maddening, and what actually, a lot of people have talked about this in about a week ago, maybe a little more than that, is that with obviously there was a problem with the air traffic controllers that because flights were being delayed because of sequester cuts. And Congress actually restored the funding for that, but mostly that's been restored because mostly rich people fly a lot, and so that's actually something that affects the rich. They're traveling a good deal. They spend many days at the airport, a couple of days at the airport a week perhaps, and so that was actually restored. But again, all these stuff that we've listed so far actually affects poor people, and that's kind of something that's kind of out of sight, out of mind, or they just flat out don't care about the poor. So let's discuss kind of how the rich aren't actually being affected by that. It's really mostly the poor.
Yeah, the cuts to the FAA were it was good to see Congress take action against that. I mean, furloughing air traffic controllers and then delaying flights is not a good thing. It can have a big impact on the economy.
Absolutely. It's bad and dangerous, right?
But it was frustrating to watch such very swift and very bipartisan action to undo those furloughs and then see the rest of sequestration cuts. Some of the ones we've outlined here, there are many others, just fall to the wayside. I don't know the last time I saw both the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, come together to pass something within 48 hours. It was kind of right. Mind-blowing to watch. And you're right in pointing out that I think the urgency behind that is that the people who are affected by flight delays tend to be wealthier people. Congress themselves, they were all about to go fly home for recess, so they were looking at flight delays. It impacts everyone, right? So they were getting a lot of angry calls from the public who was trying to fly. And the poor just don't have a similar voice. There's been a lot of research done that Congress tends to vote much more in line with the needs and desires of the wealthy than with the poor. They just don't have that voice in Congress. And so if we're going to start doing this piecemeal approach, which is what it's starting to look likely that Congress wants to do, it's very worrisome because some of the biggest impacts are going to be on the most vulnerable who really cannot afford to lose these vital programs, and their needs may go unmet. I thought it was really interesting, too. Some of this is being fueled also by the media. There was a study of media mentions right around the flight delays, sort of the peak of that, concern. And the FAA furloughs were mentioned 2.5 times more than Head Start. more than 2 times more than Medicare patients turned away from cancer clinics, and 6.5 times more than cuts to Meals on Wheels. So we're all going to need to spend a little bit more time thinking about the broad impact of this package of cuts, not try and sort of isolate different pieces, because that could really be not a good thing for the poor who don't have a voice in trying to get the whole package of cuts reversed.